Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We are so happy to have you here with us, learning about treaties this week. It's an important week. This is new learning for so many people. And you may notice behind me here in my background that there is a sea of poppies. As just a reminder that coming up next week is Remembrance Day, but also is another important day that a lot of people don't know about, which is November 8th, known as Indigenous Veterans Day. So again, another opportunity to learn about some incredible Indigenous people, past and present. So we're excited today to bring forward new learning. And I'm going to turn it over to Isaac here, who's going to introduce himself and get started. So over to you, Isaac.
Thank you very much, Jody. The poppies look beautiful. So, Ani Bojo, Manzinapkinegego'anaabe Anishinaabe, Ginebeguk Shabigajwat and Donjaba, Ganoje and Dodem, Anishinaabe Nini and Dao, Nimkiajbikang Nin Da, Ngichi Nen Dam Ya Mampi Giganonenguk. My name is Isaac Murdoch. I'm from Serpent River First Nation. I'm from the Fish Clan. I'm Ojibway, and I currently reside at Nimkiajbikang. Now, my native name, Manzinapkinegego'anaabe, the name that I was given, it means the animal who paints the rocks. But it's also an animal that can turn into a man. And I come from the place where the serpents are painted on the rocks. So kind of like the old cave paintings, with the red paint and stuff like that. I am Ojibway. I belong to the Anishinaabe Nation, which is a very big nation that spans all across of North America. And I live at a place called Thunder Mountain, which is a beautiful spot in the forest. I live off grid. I have solar energy and a wood stove, and it's just a beautiful way to live, and I'm very proud to call it my home. Today we're going to be talking about a promise, a treaty. Wawindamage is how we'd call this. Wawindamage is when you make a promise. Wawindamage win, it means to the way of a promise. And so today we're going to be talking about treaties and promises. Because a long time ago, when our people went into treaties with the British, we had special agreements with them. It was our understanding that promises were being made. Wawindamage, that a promise was made. And so I want to explore through the Indigenous worldview of what a promise really is. So when we make a promise, it comes from our heart, it comes out of our mouth, our words will speak what our heart says, and the words will travel and go into the other person's mouth and down into their heart. And so a long time ago, that's what we thought was happening, was a promise, a very spiritual heart-to-heart promise was being made. Wawindamage. And that's what that means. It means the light that shines on the heart. And that's what our word for a promise is. And so a long time ago, of course, there was a whole series of events that took place that led up to the oppression of Indigenous people today and how all these promises were broken. But the thing is that just because they're broken in the past, it doesn't mean that they have to be broken tomorrow. We can make a big difference in restoring these promises and in ensuring that we all work together and that we create a better world for tomorrow. So I believe that things can change and that there's really good people out there and that we can do things that can make a worldly difference for everybody. And I think during climate change and, all the shenanigans that's happening all around the world, I think that, it's kind of our responsibility to do that too. But first, let's look at a historical timeline of these agreements and these treaties that were made with my tribe, the Anishinaabe, because I think it's important to understand it through a historical lens so that we can kind of see how things played out in the end, but more importantly, how we can actually do things differently in the future. And I think that's why it's so important to know our history, because if you know where you've been, then you know where you're going to go. And so, before contact, before the Europeans arrived on these lands, our people already had many treaties already. We already had many agreements. We already understood the laws that were here. And so as Indigenous people, we believe that the land carries and nourishes these laws that exist here, for the water, for the trees, for the birds, that the land is carries that within itself. And these are called natural laws, or sometimes we call them Anishinaabe laws. So as Anishinaabe, we adopted these natural laws to become our own, because of course we had to coexist with nature. And it was through this adoption of laws that we were able to sustain the ecology and the water systems for thousands of years without compromise, simply because we knew that we had to comply to the existing natural laws that exist on the land. And so, in order to ensure that those laws, we call them Manzinapkinegego'anaabe, to ensure that those laws were always in place, we would have agreements with the Mtigul, the trees, with the Chesinig, with the big stones. We would have agreements with the Anaquanuk, with the clouds. We would have agreements with, the Wesiwag, the animals, the, the Geekowug, the fish. So we already had all these sort of treaties and agreements with the natural world so that we always understood our place as human beings in a very diverse and beautiful ecosystem. And so the treaties are reminders, and they're also mnemonic devices. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit. And I'm even going to explain that word. And so treaties were a way to remind us of the laws and the agreements that were made. And of course, before the Europeans came, we also had treaties with other tribes. So my tribe, the Ojibway, the Anishinaabe, had agreements with other tribes. And so right here, I have something in my hand called God'o'nage'anaabe. It means the dish with one spoon, and it's right here. And so when you look at this, this is a wampum belt. And this wampum belt is an ancient treaty amongst tribes. And there's many tribes that are a part of that treaty. And so it wasn't until, I believe, probably the late 1600s, the early 1700s, when we were accepted into this treaty that was made by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And this treaty here means our dish. And that in this belt, you have a beaver tail and you have a spoon. And that we're going to eat the same beaver tail together, and that we're going to feast on it with one spoon. We're going to share the spoon. And that, for forever and ever, we're going to respect each other and we're going to share with each other. That's how I understand this agreement. So this is a pre-Confederate agreement. This is a pre-contact agreement. So this happened before the settlers came, this was made. We just ended up joining it after the settlers came. But there was many tribes that were a part of this, not just the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And so this is an example of an agreement based on natural law of sharing and caring for each other. Now that agreement is made out of this, the shell. And so this is, we call this migas, and it's a shell that's found in the ocean, and there's a little bit of purple on there. And you'll notice that purple is used to make the purple in the center. The beads are very hard to make. First off, you have to get the right kind of shells that have the right thickness, that have the right color quality. And then once you have the right shell, of course, you have to make the beads out of them. And the holes inside of the beads can only be drilled in water because it can be very brittle. And the heat of the drilling will crack the bead. And that's why it's got to be drilled in water. And so a long time ago when they made the belts, it took a long time to make a belt. And it was something incredible. And these belts were used for years and years. But it's not the kind of belt that you put around your waist. These are the belts that you have like this, that you're used to carry something on your back. And so these belts were like straps that were used because we're carrying something. And the idea was that we were carrying responsibility and that we were carrying this agreement. And that every year we'd get together and we'd dust the belt. We'd wipe the dust off of it so that the light would shine off the shells and bring us everlasting wisdom, to be kind to each other. Again, the reason why they use the shell is because the shell obviously has the purple in it, which is pretty cool. But they say that the shell is medicine that comes from the sky. And that many years ago, there's a story of when a woman fell from the moon and her medicine bag opened up and it landed in the water. And ever since, her medicine has been washing up on shore and we've been collecting them. And these are the shells. So our laws, our Manzinapkinegego'anaabe, go to the very depths of the deepest waters, all the way up to the sky and everything in between. And so these laws were very, very sacred to us. And when we agreed to these laws, it was absolutely critical that we followed them because it was a promise. It was a promise that included so much. And again, it was a very spiritual and heartfelt promise when we made these agreements with the shells. So what's really cool about, today's world is that, things are done in a different way. So if we're going to make an agreement today, usually we get lawyers, we draft things out on paper, there's lots of negotiation, there's, everything is articulated in that agreement. And there's a code of conduct when we make agreements in today's society. In today's legal world, there's a code of conduct when making agreements. So anyway, the British came and they started to lay claim to the land. And of course, there's something called the Doctrine of Discovery, which is very simple. It's you can go out there, the Pope and the churches gave people the authority to go out there. And if you can find land that doesn't have Christians on it, you can take it as your own. And you can turn them into slaves and kill them if they're pagans. And so basically that's what happened here. They came here and, the French were here, the British were here, the Spaniards were here, and, they're all fighting each other, trying to lay claim to these lands under this Doctrine of Discovery. And it was the British that defeated the French on the Plains of Abraham And of course, like 1757, or yeah, it's like long time ago. And the British defeated the French and started to lay their flags on our lands. That was the Doctrine of Discovery. And they started to call this Crown Lands, a title that still exists in the legal framework today. And so that happened for a while. And I'm going to play you just a part of a song that talks about that. Because shortly after they started to lay the flags, they came up with a document called the Royal Proclamation. And the Royal Proclamation was an assertion of their title on our lands. And so I want to play a little bit for you. This song was recorded on my reserve back in the 1940s. It was passed down from generation to generation to generation. And they figure that the song actually goes to the Royal Proclamation because the song is singing about what the Royal Proclamation is saying, which was in 1763. And we're going to press start. And we are going to see if we can do this again. There we go. So the song says, Nabigwan, Nabigwan, and the Gamad said, the ships are here. We know that they're here for the land. We know that that's what they want. The British are making us promises. The British are making us promises. She sings it twice. The British are saying, for as long as the sun shines and the grass grows, they will forever keep their promises. This is what they are saying. The ship is here. Wawin, that's the promise word I was saying before. So the British are making us promises, and they want to give us pots and guns to show that they're going to keep their promise. They have silver that they want to give us for this land. But how can we can't give them the land and the animals and the fish and the waters. How are we going to live if we don't have nothing? So that's the song. And it's a very old song because in the Royal Proclamation, which is a document that basically stated that that the British were going to have special interests on the lands and that we weren't allowed to sell the land to the French, and that for as long as the sun shines and the grass grows, our lands won't be molested, and that, we'll forever live in peace and harmony. So that's kind of the Royal Proclamation. So what happened after that was the United States was formed. And of course, they started to lay their flags here as well. So now we got everybody laying their flags all over the place. And so, we had the French, we had the British, we had the Americans, all at one time, and the Spaniards all at one time lay their flags in our territories. So once the Americans started to do that, it created a war. And my great-great-grandfather started that war, and it's called the War of 1812. And basically, he took 800 soldiers to Fort Mackinac in the United States of America, and he challenged the United States government to a battle. And of course, it created the War of 1812. And that happened on St. Joseph Island when they left on July 16th, 1812. And there was, I think 47 British soldiers that went with him and his 800 warriors, and they took over Fort Mackinac. And it led a massive war between the United States and the Americans. Well, 2 years later, there was a treaty that was made between the British and the Americans called the Treaty of Ghent that took place in Belgium. And the indigenous people were not at the treaty, they weren't invited to the treaty, and they also didn't know that it was happening. And that's how the boundaries of what is now known as Canada and the United States were formed. It was formed without our consent, without our knowledge, and the idea of nations being created on our lands was something that we weren't aware of. And so my people were very upset. And of course, now that these nations were in development of being made, they started to develop to build their nations. And again, my tribe got very, very mad and decided to go to war against the British. And my great-great-grandfather led a revolt against the British. And at that time, he was arrested, but he was quickly released so that there would not be a war. And he told the government that there is no treaty or agreement amongst us. And that's what we need to do. And so the Crown, or the British at the time, made a treaty. Now, what's important to note is that during this treaty, we had one understanding of what it meant, because our people did not speak English at the time, and our worldview was different. And the British had a certain intention in the treaty, which was very different than ours. And during that treaty, medals were given, much like this one here. So this is a treaty medal, and they were made out of silver. They were polished regularly. This is Queen Victoria on the back. And these medals were given at the treaty, and it was said that we'd have to polish the silver, and that would renew our treaty relationship. And on this medal, you can't see it, but I see the sun shining, I see the grass, I see the all of the things that the song was saying. And of course, the peace and friendship. And of course, on the back, you have Queen Victoria, who was a queen that existed in the 1800s. So the treaties, the contemporary paper treaties were made, but they weren't exactly what we agreed to. That was written down on paper. So our agreement was that the British were to have free passage through our land, and that we're to respect their farms, that they were to dig no deeper than the depth of a plow, because we believe that there is spiritual beings and there is an underworld of serpents and big monsters, and that if we dug into the ground, we could release their power and it could destroy the earth. It was also agreed that we would protect each other's children during times of war, famine, and sickness, and that the shoreline of every waterway, that the length of 6 human beings, which would be close to 66 feet on every waterway, would be undisturbed for the animals and for the people that were traveling. And of course, it was understood that the sacred agreement, that it was going to be an agreement of peace and friendship, and that we were going to see how it was going to go, and so that we could further develop our peace and friendship agreement. And that became known as the Robinson-Huron Treaty. But what was written down on the treaty by the British was that we completely surrendered the land. We ceded and surrendered the land, that mining and logging would get special privileges, and that our people would get, $1 something a year. And that didn't turn out too good, because our way of life was supposed to never stop. We were supposed to always have access to the land as a free people. That was our agreement, and that we were going to share in peace and friendship our land with the British. Well, soon after that treaty was made, Canada was made. So Canada is really the first British colony to make its own treaty. And once Canada was made, then it created the Indian Act, which is a really racist legislation that's used to control Indigenous people. All of the Indigenous people were forced off the land. They were contained on reservations and then filtered through colonizations, through residential schools and other institutions. And so they did this because Canada wanted to have a free-for-all in resource extraction in our territories, which they did, which caused a massive ecological collapse. And so that's kind of where we are now. But I don't believe that history defines who we are. I think that history is a reminder of who we don't have to be. We don't have to be like that. And that right now we have a great opportunity for change. We have a great opportunity to ensure that life will be better for future generations. And so at this time, I would like to leave the floor open for any questions that we may have. And if there's questions, I'd love to answer them.
Well, there are questions coming in, and I want to remind people that if you want to submit a question, the form was emailed out, so you can access it there, or on the YouTube right now, if you scroll down in the below in the description box, click on show more, and there's a link to the form. You can access the form there to submit your question.
Great.
So let me just look at some of these questions here. Before we get into the questions, I wanted to talk about something. You had mentioned about having a different worldview, and not only having a different worldview, how leadership was done in terms of being a matriarchal society versus what also came in through colonialism. Colonialism brought in patriarchy. And so I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the importance of women and the consequence of what's happened and the change in how leadership forced women out
So
of those roles.
yeah, that's a really good question. So during the colonial treaties, women were not allowed to be present in the negotiations because back at that time, women were viewed as property. They weren't actually viewed as people with their own minds and decision-making powers. And so the British viewed women as property, and they were not allowed to be a part of the treaty negotiations, which would actually, in a legal definition in today's world, make that agreement null and void. So say if there was a company that said, okay, let's make an agreement, but you can't have women be a part of this, then it would not be a legally recognized agreement. And so that's what happened a long time ago, is the British didn't want the women to be, they felt that it wasn't their place or their role because they didn't have the power or the authority to make those types of agreements or those types of deals. And where I come from, we come from a very, very equitable, um, government where, everything has a place, everything has a role. And that, growing up, I remember that, the old people, made the decisions, primarily made the decisions, the important ones, and that people had their own autonomy to live their lives. And that, oftentimes it was the very old that were the ones that would say, well, maybe we should do it this way, maybe we should do it that way. And it was understood that that's what we were going to do. And so the grandmothers certainly had a very strong position in our communities. Same with the grandpas. The elders, basically, whatever gender they were, had a very strong influence in our communities. And, but during the treaty process, that was actually disturbed. So there was no people that were two-spirited or trans or anything like that were allowed to be at those meetings. But in our community, they are very, very respected and valued. And so, um, that was a big thing. The only gender that was allowed at those treaty negotiations were males. And we all know that when you just get a bunch of males in the room, I'm going to say that things could be a little bit better if there was some more equity in that room, if there was more equality. And so, but again, this is something that was forced upon our people. And so there is a lot of stories about that. And I remember a long time ago, they'd say, well, how can the agreements even be real if the women were not even there? How can it be a legitimate agreement? And, and that's a valid question, because how can you have an agreement with a nation when half of the nation is not even allowed to participate? That could not happen in today's system. Legally, that would not be allowed. You couldn't have like a major corporation go into agreement with another company, but say there is women that were sitting on the board and they said, well, we can't make an agreement with you because you have women on your board. And until they are actually removed as decision makers, we're not going to deal with you, period. Well, that wouldn't stand. Actually, that company would be probably charged. Like there would be a legal repercussion for that. And any sort of agreement under that sort of duress would not be recognized as a legal valid agreement in today's legal context. But good
So the
question.
questions are pouring in now. So we'll try and get through as many as we can. We might not get to all of them. So I want to thank you for everyone who's submitting their questions. So this next one comes from Dominic. He says, who was your great, great, great grandfather? Do you want to talk a little bit about this incredible person you've mentioned?
My great, great, great grandfather, his name was Jingwak. And Jingwak was very, very fascinating. I'm going to show you a picture of Jingwak. Jingwak was, of course, a very powerful medicine man that fasted many, many years. And I'm going to show you a picture of his son, who is my great grandfather. I'm going to show you right now. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so this is Gishke, who was the chief of Shingwak, who was my great grandfather. Can you see that okay?
Maybe try coming a little bit closer and then hold still. So it's a little washed out.
Yeah, it's a little washed out. Okay, so that
But
was
cool nonetheless. That's amazing.
my great grandfather. And then of course we had Chief Shingwak himself, who was an extraordinary leader, who was a spiritual person, and of course spent his whole life trying to protect his lands, from destruction of mining and those types of things. He didn't want mining at all. And he actually held a large resistance against the miners and thought that it was very important to protect the lands as always. And so this here is a picture of my great great grandfather and grandmother. So this is kind of neat. And I'll show that to you, and hopefully we can see it better. But this is an actual photograph of them.
And can you tell us a little bit about where you're from? There's a few questions that have asked about where you're from.
So I'm from Serpent River First Nation, but I also have family in Garden River First Nation. And so I have family in both. I'm kind of from both of those places. And it's on the north shore of Lake Huron, which is kind of straight north. It's kind of like in the middle between Sault Ste. Marie and Sudbury, through that area there. That's where I come from. That's where my people are from.
So another question that's here is from, hang on, sorry, there's many of them. So I want to make sure. I believe this one is a student from Halton. What was the first treaty to be recorded here on these lands by Indigenous people?
That would be hard. I think if we're talking about treaties with the British or people from Europe, I think those treaties happened a long time ago with other nations. I know that we never had any real treaties until 1850. We had peace and friendship agreements. We had understandings, but there was no formal agreement until 1850. Other tribes might have had them earlier, but again, I don't know, because I don't really know the history of about other tribes, and I can't really speak on their history either. But that's a good question. But I'm going to say that it happened probably in the 16 or 1700s. It would be the late 1600s, early 1700s, for sure.
Another question that's come in from Hastings Prince Edward District School Board is, why do you believe the colonial powers, in a sense, twisted the treaties in their favor?
Well, that was very simple, is that they wanted to have full access to the land. The land meant more resources, meant more taxes. And so, the crown was doing this all over the world. So the crown their catchphrase was that the sun would never set on the British Empire, meaning that they were going to have complete ownership over the whole world. And so they didn't even try to hide that fact. And so their whole mandate was to try to control the whole world. And so that's why when the sun sets, so in this medal, you'll see the sun setting. I don't know if you can see it or not. I wish you could. You can't, but the sun is setting, which means that it doesn't actually go down. And when the sun sets, the sky turns red. And that's why the British coats were red. It represented that the sun never goes down, that they're going to have everything. And so the reason why they twisted the treaties was to have everything. That was, and by the time they came to North America, they had already done this for several hundreds of years all over Europe. So they were professionals at it. I mean, they did this all over Scotland and Ireland and like you name it, like all over the world. I mean, at one point they even had Jerusalem. Like they were very good at what they did, and they were after world domination. And they didn't even try to hide the fact.
Another question from Halton is, how did people communicate with each other and make treaties if they spoke different languages?
That's a good question. So we had people that were interpreters, people that would interpret things. And what's very fascinating is that in a lot of treaties, the interpreters were either not allowed in, or in some cases, they were there at gunpoint. And so the army was called in sometimes, and the interpreters were there at gunpoint. And so the interpreters would try to interpret back and forth. But even so, the British were telling the interpreters one thing. So there's some of these interpreters had documents and journals, and they were saying exactly the same thing that we were saying, but they didn't write it down the same way. And so the British were given a clear mandate on how to live here on these lands, because we understood how the ecology was and the natural laws were and are. And so we were trying to explain to them, we're trying to help them and say, this is how you live here on these lands. And of course, the British were nodding and they were saying, yes, I understand. Tell them that we fully agree and all of this stuff. But then they went back to their offices and drafted the agreements, and which were nothing like what we had agreed to. So there was a lot of shenanigans.
So oftentimes questions come up, why are we just learning about this now? So there's a reason for that too, which is kind of tied into what you're just saying.
Yeah, so a lot of the truths about the history were hidden and erased on purpose so that you would never get to know. And this was a way to guard and protect the theft of the land. And so, for example, 5 years ago, I couldn't have this conversation with you because it wouldn't be allowed. But today it's allowed because of the truth and reconciliation that's happening. And so with that, the government has a mandate to say, yes, Indigenous people need to tell the truth. The truth needs to be told about what happened. And the truth needs to be exposed so that we never repeat these things again. And so now Indigenous people are actually able to say, yes, there has been a genocide. Yes, our lands have been stolen. Yes, there was a big land theft and a lot of our people died. And yes, a lot of children were stolen from their parents and not allowed to go home. And, yada, 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 goes on and on and on. And so now we're actually able to say it, as before we weren't really allowed to. And I think that the school systems right now, because this is so new, really don't know how to take this information. Because you have an Indigenous person saying that our lands are stolen and we want some of it back. Because it's the right thing to do. When you steal something, you give it back. Obviously, not all of it can be given back because, people need to live, but there should be no reason that some of it can't be given back. And even the Department of Indian Affairs minister says the same thing. The highest levels of government are also saying the same thing. that Canada is changing, that it's not going to be the same, simply because there's too many Indigenous people, and we're the highest growing population. And because of the numbers are starting to reach a threshold of acceptance, there's no way that the government can say no to a lot of things. And so one of the things that they're saying is, yes, Indigenous people need some of their land back that was stolen. There's no question. And so this was hidden from you on purpose, so to guard and protect the land theft. But now we know that we can't do that anymore, and that the truth has been exposed. And so, and hopefully good change will happen. Just because we get land back doesn't mean that we're bad people. What it means is that corrections are being made. And it also means that we're not separated. Even though I'm Anishinaabe, I'm not Canadian. That doesn't mean that we don't still have an obligation to work together under the spirit and intent of those agreements, that we're going to make sure that our children are safe, that we respect each other, we respect each other's way of life. All of those things still stand. But nowhere in the agreement did we ever say that Canada gets everything and we get nothing. And so I think you have a responsibility, just the same way that I have a responsibility, to ensure that these peace agreements are educated properly, so that everything is shared, that the environment is protected. But that's a very good question.
Well, we have a special caller, a phone-in caller on our show today. So, okay, Troy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Swego.
Hey.
Ani, how are you, Isaac?
I'm doing good. How are you, Troy?
I'm good. It's so nice to be able to participate and listen in on this conversation. And, I've been hearing some awesome questions come out from the different boards. And, one of the questions that I heard was, what was the first treaty? And, I said I have to call in and talk about that just for a second. And that was what we call the Gaswenta. And that was with my people, the Haudenosaunee people. That was between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch back in 1613, for those people who are wondering. And it was super, super important. And some people may have seen it or heard of it. It's called the two-row wampum. That's how some people like to talk about it. And what that means is that those two rows actually represent, the first peoples of this land and the Dutch at the time. But that was later adopted by the British, who Isaac's been talking about. So the British also agreed to this treaty. And what this treaty was, is it said that we will live together on this land, side by side, in peace, friendship, and respect. So if you were to see and look at that two-row wampum, you'll see that there's 3 white lines. And in between, on that treaty belt, on the wampum belt, there are 3 rows of white beads between those 2 purple lines. And they're bound in peace, friendship, and respect. So that is the basis of what these treaties were about. And Isaac's been doing just a fantastic job talking about how, as people, we need to get back to that understanding of living beside one another in peace, friendship, and respect, and moving forward in that good way. So I think that's that's something I wanted to share, Isaac. And I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit more about some of those peace and friendship agreements and that understanding around, our responsibilities to each other in the land. I missed a little bit of the conversation. You may have just been talking about that as I was calling in, but it's just been great listening to everybody call in or write their questions and hear your explanation of everything.
So while you were talking there, Troy, Isaac showed an image of the Gaswanta or the two-row wampum belt as you were talking. So people got a visual of it. And
Nice.
I want to just mention here too, because another thing that's new for people to learn about is the many distinct nations that have always existed and are still existing here. Because when we talk about why we're only learning about this, and if we think about what kind of maps do we see in schools, we only see the map of Canada. So we actually have here, like Isaac was mentioning, he's Anishinaabe. You heard earlier some of the language, Anishinaabe language, and Troy is from a very completely different nation that he also introduced himself. Troy, do you want to explain a little bit about your nation?
Sure. So I am from the Manzinapkinegego'anaabe nation, which is, some people call us Mohawk, but in our language, we call ourselves the Manzinapkinegego'anaabe. And we are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is made up of 6 separate nations. And we live in southern Ontario, I guess you could say, and New York State. Our homelands would have been in the New York State and a little bit part of the North Shore. So, when Isaac was talking about the dish with one spoon, that was actually an agreement that happened between our people, the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people, and it encompassed that northern part of Lake Ontario. But then, as Isaac said, so many more nations adopted that because it's such a powerful understanding and treaty that we are all to share the land in a good way. We never take everything. We always share. And that was because Isaac's people and our people, we were like neighbors. And sometimes we didn't get along. So we set up these other agreements and understanding so that it's like, okay, we need to stop this and just live in a good way with each other, right? So we set up these agreements. So that's where that peace and friendship came with our people. But that also happened in other parts of the country too, as Isaac was talking about.
Awesome. Thank
Back
you
to
so
you.
much, Troy. That's
Well, thank you
amazing.
for calling in, Troy.
Thanks. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. So that is so cool. So Troy is he's a teacher, but he's also a very good with history and very well versed with his law, of course, the customs and laws of his people. So it was a great honor to have Troy, bump on to this and teach us about the two-row wampum belt, because that is a very important belt. Of course, I was showing it as he was talking. And so to finish off, do we have one last question?
Oh, we have tons of questions. Like, I feel bad we're not going to get to all of these questions. Maybe I'll ask this one here. What do you think reconciliation will or should look like?
Land back.
Let's talk about that.
Indigenous people need to have some of their lands back, and that we need to be the orchestrator of how that looks like. It's not fair that everything gets taken away from Indigenous people, and there is a theft, and we're talking that people's lives are affected by this, and so it's only fair that Indigenous people get some of their lands back. And so how that looks like is that Indigenous people, and just imagine this, Indigenous people are like a pine tree or a flower or a beaver. We're indigenous to this ecosystem. We're actually biologically connected to these ecosystems. And so, it's almost like, returning back to where we come from. We need to have some land back so that we can be who we truly are and exist in our ecosystems, how we choose to live. And so that to me is reconciliation. That is the very first thing. And so this has to be done in a very respectful way. And so government recognizes this. We know that they know that the wrongs have to be made right again. And this doesn't mean that all of the land is going to be taken away from Canadians. What it means is that Indigenous people will be getting some land back. And that's a good thing. Because when something is stolen, you give it back. It's simple as that. You teach that to little kids. But that would be, the first thing. Of course, reconciliation is really working together, creating bridges, so that we're able to establish, possibilities and outcomes that are really good for the environment and also good for future generations. And so reconciliation is also that, repairing the relationship damage that was caused by the land theft and by the genocide that happened with to Indigenous people. Really good question. That's a loaded question. You could do a whole documentary on that question.
Yeah, and I think too that part of attending this session is part of reconciliation. So before you can take action on something, you have to take the time to really learn about it. So I look at it as, with this new education that we're in, with now Treaty Recognition Week and initiatives such as this is an opportunity to take the time to start to really learn and become educated. So I want to encourage you all to keep coming to sessions like this and keep learning about these truths and ask questions. Ask questions. That's the most, important thing you can do. Is don't just take everything you see as facts. Make sure you're really looking at who's telling that information. Unfortunately, textbooks are still quite problematic and have lots of inaccurate information. So, it's important that we learn truths from the people that are most impacted by what's been happening. So any last words, Isaac, before we wrap up here?
Well, first off, I just want to thank you, Jody, for hosting this amazing event on promises and treaty. I also want to thank Troy for coming on as a distinguished guest and mentor. And I also want to thank all of the students and the teachers that logged in. I truly believe that when we have a responsibility-based agenda that's based on mutual friendship and respect, that we can change everything, that we can make the world a better place. There's no question that we're in climate change. There's no question that an ecological collapse is happening. But that doesn't mean that, it's the end. Really, this could be an amazing beginning. And when we look at the original promises of dignity and respect for each other and the land, we can change everything in an instant. So believe in each other, lift each other up, speak good about each other, believe in other people's dreams. And most importantly, respect everything. And when we do that, the world changes and we have the power to make that happen. And so be kind to each other, be safe, just, and be happy, life is about finding happiness and joy, even in the little things. And so, it's a great honor to be here with you. And, maybe one day I'll be in your classroom talking about stuff. That would be cool. But until then, be safe and be well. And many blessings to you and your families. Thank you so much. Miigwech.